We have won the die roll this time around, so we have an interesting hand here for sure. I'm going to keep it actually. We may definitely miss a land drop or two, but we have a counterspell, and we have multiple counterspells. We have one counterspell which we can immediately cast, and we also have a removal spell which we can immediately cast, even if we brick on lands for a turn or two. Then if we draw that third blue source, we're going to be online with the Void Shatters. So even though it is a 2-land hand on the play, which is a little bit risky, I think the upside is high enough that this hand is worth keeping. Now, if you took away some of these 3 and 4 if you took away some of these spells for 6 mana spells, then I think the situation definitely changes. But we're looking at hands of all 2s and 3s and 1/4, so looks like our opponent's starting out with a Hissing Quagmire, so we'll see if that does mean black-green Delirium, which is the most likely scenario, is that our opponent's playing that deck. But just a pass here on turn 2, so that could mean that our opponent has a hand without a Grimflayer in it. This is all under the assumption that our opponent is playing black-green. So we have found a Plains, which is not the land we really wanted, but it's okay for now. We are going to want that. If we get to the 4th land, we're going to be extremely happy, because that's going to mean Glimmer of Genius, and we'll be in a great spot at that point. Here's a Grapple with the pass. We could Revolutionary Rebuff, but not really interested in doing it. First of all, our opponent's only going to be able to get back in Evolving Wilds, so yes, they're helping. That helps with Delirium, the Grapple, but we want to have a counterspell in case of Liliana coming down. So it looks like, once again, our opponent is just going to pass the turn. So we're really playing this waiting game. Now we drew the Anticipate. Unfortunately, we don't really want to cast it here. We want to be able to hold up this Revolutionary Rebuff. So we'll just wait. Now a Tireless Tracker is coming down. So we can just rebuff this because our opponent's pretty likely to have a land to follow up with it. We could also just get rid of it with a Harness Lightning. So there's definitely a couple options in terms of how do we want to deal with this Tireless Tracker. So our opponent decided, it looks like, not to play it last turn. And I think we want to just get this rebuff out of our hand. There are going to be savvy players who are able to play around Revolutionary Rebuff as the game goes longer. And it looks like our opponent was planning to follow up with that Evolving Wilds, which we knew about. So that would have generated our opponent 2 cards, essentially. And I like just not giving our opponent the cards. Now, we do have to be wary that Ishkanah is something that could come down here, and our opponent does have Delirium. So here's a Traverse the Ulvenwald. We'll see exactly what our opponent wants to go get. It looks like it's going to be another copy of Tireless Tracker. Interesting. So this one we don't have the option of countering. And it looks like that our opponent had a second copy of Evolving Wilds. So in response to this fetching with Evolving Wilds, we can just go ahead and get rid of the Tireless Tracker. So our opponent's only going to net that 1 clue from it. And that gets the Harness Lightning out of our hand too. But still a little stuck on lands. Kind of forced to pass the turn to hold up Void Shatter. And yeah, here's a Liliana, so we're just going to go ahead and Void Shatter that. And it's nice that that Planeswalker doesn't get added to our opponent's graveyard, because it would help with Delirium purposes if it did. And here's Aether Hub, okay. So we're starting to hit our land drops, but our opponent still has a bunch of cards in hand, so we got to be worried about that. But okay, this could be pretty good news. So our opponent's activating the Hissing Quagmire here. So we've got some options in terms of how we want to approach this. We could Blessed Alliance the Quagmire, we could Harness Lightning, or we could just take the damage. I think I like the idea of just getting rid of the Quagmire in this spot. So the question is, which way do we believe is most efficient? Which removal spell do we want to use? I think I like just using the Blessed Alliance. And we could gain the life as well. But I would rather not do that, and that's my fault. I shouldn't have tapped that island, but it's okay. If we have to use the Void Shatter, we will. But it looks like our opponent's following up with the Grimflayer. So what we can do now is we can just Harness Lightning away the Grimflayer. So yeah, let's go ahead and go for that. Radiant Flames is not the best in this matchup. It normally gets sided out. So not too happy to draw that. Although if somehow there's a bunch of spiders that do find their way into play, we can definitely use it. So now our opponent's going ahead and just going for it with this Noxious Gearhulk. And we've got some options in terms of how we want to navigate this turn. Do we want to just use our Void Shatter? Not so sure that we do. So I kind of like going for the Anticipate and seeing what we can find off of it. So we see Nahiri. I like taking Nahiri. And now the question is, how do we want to deal with the Gearhulk? And I think we just want to go ahead and use the Void Shatter, because that's just the best use of our mana for the turn. And we always have to be wary about how quickly our opponent can get to Emrakul. So this is the best opportunity that we're gonna have in order to in terms of getting to cast Nahiri here. So yep, just gonna jam Nahiri. And then we've got a little bit of a decision in terms of what we want to discard. I think I'm going to go with the Radiant Flames. Just not that high impact of a card. Now, our opponent definitely could play Ishkanah here, but that's just something we have to be ready for. And unfortunately, we still haven't had the opportunity to cast this Glimmer. Looks like a Ruinous Path, so that's pretty darn annoying. Wow. Okay, well, that's pretty good for our opponent. Fumigate the draw. Alright, so we're just going to pass here. And see how our opponent wants to play this. Looks like the play is going to be activating a Hissing Quagmire. So we can flash the Gearhulk here if we want to. And get rid of the Quagmire. We could also just take the damage, because it's pretty likely our opponent has something like a Grasp of Darkness in hand. So I kind of like just taking it. Yeah, we'll fall to 10 here. And we've got We can use the Gearhulk to get back Void Shatter if we want to. So we'll see if our opponent, what our opponent wants to do to follow up here. So with 8 lands and 4 card types in graveyard, we do have to be quite worried about Emrakul. But Emrakul isn't necessarily the end of the world if we can navigate it properly. So I'm going to go for the Glimmer of Genius here. Got 2 cards that we want, so we're just going to put the Stasis Snare and the Gearhulk into our hand and proceed on. And if our opponent goes for the exact same play, now we are going to want to react to that. So here's a Transgress the Mind. We could just Gearhulk and counterspell this with a Gearhulk, and I think I like that play. And that way our opponent doesn't know what's in our hand either, which is kind of nice. So just going to go ahead, use one of our Void Shatters, get the Transgress out of our opponent's hand. And we're going to wait to see if our opponent has a good follow-up here or not. If our opponent attacks, we basically know that our opponent is representing Grasp of Darkness here. So if we block, our opponent will definitely use that Grasp of Darkness. So the question is, are we happy with that trade? I think we can fall down to 6 here. It's a little bit risky for sure. If we block and grasp that, and they use their grasp, then that could open up the Gearhulk for next turn. All right, I guess I've kind of talked myself into just making this block to preserve our life total, and it also means that if our opponent grasps here, that means they can't play Ishkana if they do happen to have it in hand. And we also know that one of the grasps has been milled. Now, it's still pretty likely our opponent does have one, but if we're able to Gearhulk next turn and then block the forest profitably, that would be pretty nice. So, yes, there is the grasp, as we predicted, but we're able to stay at 10, and there's a Grimflayer. So this actually works out in terms of the plan to use the Fumigate this turn. So I'm just going to go ahead and Fumigate, even though if our opponent, let's see, could go land Emrakul, but we're willing to take that risk. And all right, so here's a Liliana. That's pretty good. So our opponent can get back a Tracker or a Grimflayer as of right now, if they would want to. I would suspect that, first of all, they could also mill something like an Emrakul or like a Ishkana that they would also want to get back. So it looks like the mill was Grimflayer and Ruinous Pass. So we now know that our opponent has multiple Ruinous Paths in their deck. So we have to be thinking about that moving forward. And here's another land. Okay. So we would like to be able to just eat the Grimflayer with our Gearhulk. So I kind of like just flashing in the Gearhulk and getting a little bit greedy and flashing back the Glimmer of Genius. And attempting to block the Grimflayer. Now our opponent definitely could have something like a Murder or a Grasp of Darkness here. Another Grasp. We see Wandering Fumarole and Radiant Flames. The Fumarole, Wandering Fumarole here is okay, but I think we'd still just rather have a spell. So I'm going to bottom those two. And we found Descend upon the Sinful, so that's a potential Emrakul out. And I'm going to once again be okay if our opponent has the Grasp, which they do. Little bit unfortunate, but at least we're staying at a reasonable life total. Now Grimflayer is able to get in a hit. So our opponent's going to be able to set up the top of their library nicely. So our draw for the turn is Glimmer, which I kind of like just going ahead and casting it now. And trying to get a better idea of what our line's going to be here. And once again, I think the Wandering Fumarole is kind of nice because it can potentially pressure the Liliana. All right, I guess this time around I'm gonna put the Fumarole on top. And so now we have this Void Shatter as well. So we may just want to. It depends really how our opponent attacks here. If they don't attack with the Hiss and Quagmire, it's a little bit suspicious. I like just taking the hit from the Grimflayer one more time, even though it means our opponent can set up their deck as they would like to. We do have 5 card types in our graveyard here, so that means Descend upon the Sinful is live. And now it looks like our opponent's passing. Interesting. So with 1 card in hand, we definitely have to be aware that Emrakul is a real possibility. So if our opponent Emrakuls us, is it the end of the world? It's pretty bad for us. We would like to be able to get this Void Shatter out of our hand. So we could cast the Descend upon the Sinful right now, just to get rid of the Grimflayer, then have Void Shatter backup for Emrakul, which seems pretty decent to me. All right, let's go for that line. I think it's pretty likely our opponent casts Emrakul right here, just based on how they've been playing the game. So there's the mill. So we'll see if our opponent gets something back with the Lily. It could definitely be a tracker. Okay, so there's the tracker. So now we can Void Shatter the tracker, which I kind of like doing, but we could also just wait and hold the Void Shatter for a big play of our opponents. Alright, I'm going to let the tracker resolve here. It is going to mean that our opponent gets a clue, but it's going to give us some protection for this turn. And this is how these games goes. We use our life total as a resource. We use our life total as a resource. It can be tricky to juggle everything that's going on sometimes, but I like how we're playing it so far. So we're now able to use the stasis snare to get rid of the tracker. Our opponent is going to draw a card. And now here's a negate off the top of our deck. So that's pretty good. We can now finally get rid of this Lily that's been causing us so many problems. And we're in a top decking spot. We're thinking that we know that our opponent has a bunch of Ishkanas left in their deck. So that's something we have to be aware of. If our opponent activates Hissing Quagmire this turn, we can fire up our Wandering Fumarole and try to block it. Here is a Mind Rack Demon, which is pretty good. I think we just want to counter it. So let's go for the Void Shatter. We're not really too happy about countering this Mind Rack Demon, because if our opponent has something else to follow it up with, we're in a really bad spot. And we know that our opponent has a lot of gas potentially still in their deck. But at the same time, we have a good amount of stuff left in our deck too. So we just have to hope that we're on the right side of the coin in this spot. And it looks like it's just going to be an activation of the Quagmire. So we can take the opportunity to make the most out of this Wandering Fumarole. So our opponent has 2 cards in hand left. We would like for one of them to be a land for sure. Any lands, in hand would be nice. Now here's a Vessel. I think we want to just go ahead and negate that. So our opponent's got 1 card left. We've got a 4/4 Angel on board, and there is a copy of Jace, Unraveler of Secrets. So we're going to play that, tick it up, and we don't really want the Emulating Glare. Spot removal. I mean, it would. Now we wish we had let that Mind Rack Demon resolve, but we didn't really know what our draws were going to be. And here is a Liliana. We're forced to let that come into play. And it looks like our opponent's got Ishkana now in the graveyard. So it may be that our opponent wants to get that one back. And so yeah, here comes Ishkana. So that's pretty good. We'll see if we're able to grind through this one. So I like ticking up our Jace. We can put the Anticipate in our hand. And we're going to attack Liliana here. And if our opponent blocks, we're happy with that, because we're able to keep more of our energy. And what we can do here, we can anticipate first and try to find a Radiant Flames. Okay, there's a Summary Dismissal. That's not bad. So we're going to put that in hand. And we're going to Harness Lightning away the Ishkana and pass the turn. Yeah, we could have Harness Lightning away the Ishkana right away. That may have been the right play, but this game has lasted for quite a while, so sometimes little mistakes like that do happen. So there's a Mind Rack Demon. We can just let that one resolve. And our opponent is Hellbent now. So that is good news. And we'll see if our opponent does elect to attack. Looks like they are going to make this attack. So we can go ahead and play our Gear Hulk. And now we've got plenty of energy. So we can just go ahead and... I like just Harness Lightning away the demon. And we can block one of the spiders. And since Liliana's on 1, our opponent can't use it now to get something back. We're down to 2, but we've got the Jace we can use to bounce the spiders if we want to. So we're actually not in that much danger, and we're in quite a good spot to close the game out. Now that we found the summary dismissal, we found exactly what we need. So our opponent's going to probably uptick the Liliana, and if we don't draw anything, we can just go ahead and return one of these spiders to our opponent's hand and start getting aggressive, being at 2. But our opponent's at 11, and we have this summary dismissal at the ready. So clearly we're prepared to go to 1 on this attack. But our opponent's only got 7 cards left in their deck, so this has really been quite the game. We have not seen Emrakul at all yet. So we have to assume our opponent's going to draw it. There's also... We would have to counter... Okay, this murder we don't have to counter. We're just going to let that resolve. We've got to save our summary dismissal for stuff like Emrakul. So we're gonna go down to 1 there, and that's a great draw for us. So now we can get a little bit greedy. Uptick our Jace. And I think we're in such a good spot we can just pass the turn here with the Angel available to block. There's a Vessel of Nascency, so our opponent can use that. We're just going to let it resolve. But we can just deck our opponent now. Our opponent's got 6 cards in deck, now down to 2. So here's Emrakul, but we're just going to go ahead and summary dismissal. And with 2 cards left in our opponent's deck, we should have this game pretty much on lockdown. We can always, if our opponent had a separate second Emrakul, we can Gear Hulk. That now we see a Ishkana. So the Glimmer of Genius here. Find Harness Lightning and Dovinbon. And just going to go ahead and counter this with a Gear Hulk. Some of the games versus Green-Black are like this. They're extremely grindy. But yeah, our opponent's only got 1 card left in deck. And this should be the game. We can kill our opponent however we want, and we were just able to completely grind our opponent out of gas, like their whole deck. Which, you know, we've got enough answers to be able to do that. So we could have won by attacking, but sometimes the games play out in weird ways. So looking at our sideboard, we don't want the Radiant Flames for sure. Blessed Alliance and Emulating Glare here. They basically, we would want them for Grim Flayers, and that's mostly it. So if our opponent has the turn 2 Flare, we want them, but sometimes they do not have the turn 2 Flare. So yeah, not a huge fan of those. Summary Dismissal is pretty good. And then Spell Quellers and Gideons, I like some number of those. Revolutionary Rebuff and Negate. Negate's a weird one. It counters Liliana, which is pretty important, so I like keeping in some of those, especially when we're on the draw. Gideon is a card that we want some of. So I like playing 2 copies of Gideon. And we can go down we can cut 1 Harness Lightning. We do want some for Grim Flayers, like I said before. So, yep, this is a pretty good configuration for game 2. Hopefully it'll be a little bit faster than the last game. And we have a 1-land hand. We're going to ship that for sure. And perfectly fine with this 2-lander. So or 3-lander rather. We're going to keep that Anticipate on top to hope to anticipate into another blue source. But if our opponent has one of their aggressive draws, we're going to be in trouble here. We don't really have any early removal. We cut down on it a little bit after sideboard. So we have no answer to a Liliana if our opponent has it on turn 3 here. And we also have no red mana to speak of, so the perfect card to hit off Anticipate would probably be Spire Bluff Canal. Here is a tracker. And not what we wanted to see, really. I'm going to take the Stasis Snare here because it gets rid of the tracker immediately. And tracker is pretty annoying to deal with here. So yeah, I'm just going to Stasis Snare the tracker. And that was a little bit greedy, but we didn't really want another Plains. We wanted an island or a mountain. So we'll see if we can find a land here. We did. Unfortunately, it comes into play tapped. So that's going to mean that we're going to take a hit from this Grimflare and be at the mercy of whatever our opponent could have this turn. They did miss a land drop, so I would assume that this Grimflare is going to set up more land drops for our opponent. And could also enable Delirium. So it's pretty scary. And this is part of what's awkward about the deck, but we're not out of it yet. So we could just, if our opponent doesn't make a big play here, we can just go Nahiri, kill Grimflare. Unfortunately, our opponent did have a solid play to make with another copy of Grimflare. So we've got a decision here for sure. I think I like going with Gideon here. Our opponent could definitely just kill it, or kill the knight, swing at Gideon. But we just want to protect ourselves this turn. If we draw another land, we can go Nahiri plus Harness Lightning, get rid of both Grimflares. Unfortunately, though, our opponent has a Vessel of Nascency, which is very good. And that can potentially set up Delirium for our opponent. So we're going to want to block the one that's coming at Gideon. Pretty easy decision there. And take the other one. Now, this Vessel's going to get cracked and probably find our opponent Delirium, but our Gideon is going to stay alive here. So, yeah, 5 types in the graveyard. Gideon goes down to 2. Now, we're still hoping for a land, but unfortunately, since the Grim players are 4/4s, the Harness Lightning won't be able to take care of one on its own. And we're just kind of one step behind for most of this game. But not out of it yet. We love something like a Fumigate there to just clean up our opponent's board really nicely. Of course, didn't find it, so just going to pass the turn here while holding up Harness Lightning and Void Shatter. So, gonna go ahead, chump block a Grim Flare here. Not really a chump block because we're gonna finish it off with the Harness Lightning. But the unfortunate part of this is our opponent's got 5 cards in hand and is getting closer and closer to having Emrakul online, being able to do what basically at the point in the game for Black Green Delirium where they can do pretty much whatever they want. And yep, definitely going to counter that. So that turn went pretty much as expected. Spell Queller is actually a pretty nice draw. I think we can be greedy here. Wait one more turn to cast our Nahiri. Because if we just cast Nahiri here, our opponent could just simply attack it with Hissing Quagmire, get rid of it. So we're just going to go ahead and take the 4 here from Grimflayer. And that's going to mean we're all the way down to 8. And we'll see if our opponent plays something. We want to Spell Queller it. We can definitely Spell Queller. So, okay, Liliana. We'll Spell Queller that. And now we have Void Shatter available to us as well. We'll see. Our opponent might have a removal spell for the Spell Queller. Looks like, okay, just going to pass the turn here. Interesting. So I think we kind of just want to use Nahiri at this point. And exile the Grimflayer. And we'll see what our opponent has this turn. Not a great spot, for sure. So there's the Murder. That's going to get rid of the Queller. It's going to allow this Liliana to come back in. So now our opponent can do a number of things to us. And not looking too great. And this is one of those grindy games of Standard, grindy matches rather, where we had a long game 1, now we're having a long game 2. Always have to be wary of what's going on time-wise, whether it's online or whether it's in person. We're going to just have to let our Nahiri bite the dust now. And okay, so Lily's gonna go down and find a Grimflayer. And all right, we drew a Harness Lightning, so we can Harness Lightning away the Grimflayer and have counter magic available for a follow-up. And we have Summary Dismissal if our opponent jams Emrakul. So now because we have that one energy left over, we can just cleanly get rid of this. And if it's not Emrakul, okay, this isn't Emrakul, we're just going to Void Shatter it. And I think we want to just take the greedy line and try to get rid of this Liliana right here and right now. So our opponent's got 6 card types. If they go untap land Emrakul, that is a very plausible scenario. There's the untap lands. There's the Ishkana. Okay, so it's Ishkana instead. That could also do it. We're going to go ahead and anticipate here. Find a Glimmer of Genius. But that's not going to be enough. We take 5 and they get drained out by Ishkana. So I'm going to concede that one and go to a third game here. So we're going to, since we're on the play, we can get more aggressive. So that can mean Spell Quellers. It can mean more Gideons. We're not as concerned about negates anymore. And also happy to shave on Harness Lightnings. So I think we can just cut a lot of our removal here and try to go on the beatdown plan for the most part. So it's a lot of 4-mana cards, but that's okay because our opponents, first of all, a lot of players board out Grimflayers on the draw. I guess we can keep in 2 Harness Lightnings and play 3 copies of Gideon, but we just want to get to 4 lands, play a Planeswalker, or have something like a Glimmer of Genius available to us on turn 4, and try to snowball that. So I'm going to submit this. We're on the play. Gonna keep this hand. We've got Void Shatter into Glimmer, potentially. So there's an Evolving Wilds. And we'll see. I mean, our opponent may have that Grimflayer, which would definitely be good here, but just because we're light on removal. And okay, so there it is. Pretty good. And this is why Grimflayer is so good. It gets our opponent to Delirium without them really having to do much, and it pressures our life total. So we actually wouldn't mind if our opponent plays something this turn just so we can get this Void Shatter out of our hand, and then next turn play the Glimmer, and go from there. But it's weird against the Black-Ring Delirium. I like sideboarding aggressively on the play, but you know we just didn't have the cards we wanted in the spot. We can go ahead and Void Shatter this Lily, which we pretty much are forced to do. And now here's a Spell Queller. So what we can potentially do when our opponent attacks is flash in the Spell Queller. And I like that. It forces our opponent to have a removal spell here, basically. Something like a Murder. And so we're moving to blocks. That's a good sign. But okay, our opponent did have it. So that's annoying. And now our opponent can go ahead and set up Delirium even further. So now the Grimflayer is actually a 4/4. And one play we could have done would have been to activate the Wandering Fumarole, but we really need our lands at this point to be able to get to the Gearhulks in our hand. So we're pretty forced to take this hit. And Omnixilis, we're just gonna have to counter that. It's gonna mean we don't get to Glimmer of Genius this turn. Here's a Gideon, which it's just not that good right now. It would have been nice if we had it earlier on turn 4, but unfortunately here, it's just not going to do it for us. So we're going to take the hit from the Grimflayer again. That's going to bring us down to 8. And we have to Glimmer of Genius this turn. There's no other option to us, but on the other hand, we're holding up counter magic. So it could be our opponent respects that. Hard to say. Alright, so there's Ishkana. So we really need to find now our Fumigate. Would be really nice. Don't want the Anticipates at this point. Too little, too late for those. And yeah, this Gideon is just not going to do it. So tough spot here. I think we're just dead on board. If our opponent has an untapped land, we are definitely dead on board. Interesting games here. Pretty typical of how the black-green games play out, but it looks like our opponent's actually going after the Gideon here, so we're not dead on board because our opponent doesn't have the untapped land. So just gonna block the Ishkana. Gideon's gonna die. So we have a draw step here to find a Wrath effect, is what it looks like. If we find Descend, if we find Fumigate, unfortunately we did not find them, so should be pretty much just dead here. But we'll make our opponent do it to us. So flashing in the Gearhulk. Gonna go ahead and target our Glimmer. And out of curiosity, let's see what we find off this Glimmer. So once again, just gonna bottom these. And we have to block the Grimflayer. We're one Ishkana activation away from just losing, though. And it looks like... Alright, so our opponent's going to play around with us, I guess, and not go for this Ishkana activation. Really no reason not to activate Ishkana here. So there's Stasis Snare. That's still not going to help our cause. Yeah, so we can Stasis Snare away the Ishkana. But yeah, we're still just dead here. Even if we were basically hoping to hit one of our Wrath of God effects, and sometimes when you get close to the end of a match, you see your opponents playing fast, and so it's easy for our opponent to just miss something like that, and we're just going to concede here. So that's going to do it.